So I do not think the role of product marketer differs that much when touching to AI versus tech in general. I guess the main challenges stay the same across different industries and verticals. The main challenge is always translating very complex and technical topics into more, I would say, public-facing ideas and outcomes. And so I think that's where the role of a product marketing is very important, is figuring out how you take a very complex solution and you make it a bit more marketable and addressable to the market you want to sell it to. So I guess in that sense, there's not a huge difference in AI. I would say the main difference I see doing this job in AI compared to other industries I've got a chance to work with like cybersecurity or fintech, is that the industry keeps moving really fast. And so in that case, you need to be able to stay up to date and stay relevant if you don't want to miss out on the latest models that come out. And so in that sense, I think the difference is really about like the pace of things at which they come out. So I think what really distinguishes a successful product using AI from all of the noise out there is really about the outcome and like what the product is actually delivering in terms of ROI. I think there's a lot of over-promising, especially in the AI industry these days, and I think it's even more important than ever to really showcase that it's an actual outcome and that the AI can bring. I think it's really about showing that AI can bring value and kind of beat the hype. And there's a lot of hype in this industry, so obviously a lot of noise and chaos in this thing, but I think that's where you can really make a difference. It's really figuring out how you can translate an actual product and the actual usage of AI in some concrete and tangible outcome and solution. So I think if you want to successfully communicate the value, again, I'll go back to one thing I mentioned earlier. It's about the outcome and about tangible ROI. So it's not just about showcasing or selling the dream or the vision. It's about showing what it actually can do on a day-to-day basis and how it can actually change either your processes, make them faster, more efficient, or even smarter. And so I think that's really the main challenge in AI, especially when you're talking about infrastructure, then it becomes a whole other ball game. But really the inference where I focus the most is actually, I guess, quite simpler to showcase the value, because with LLMs, a lot of people have got a chance to try out ChatGPT or Claude, and they've been able to actually see a tangible value at a very simple level using a chatbot. And so I guess once you find that aha moment and you replicate it to other use cases or industry or verticals, then actually it's much easier to showcase the value of AI in the products. So I think a lot of AI startups make some mistakes when starting out with AI and building out their go-to-market, in the sense that sometimes they will, for example, start with the model instead of actually starting with the expected outcome or the expected use case. And so in that sense, I think the whole thought process should be around what we want to build, and then you break that down into smaller, like different tasks, and you approach it in a very more strategic way instead of actually falling into the hype and just figuring out how you just put AI into any product. You figure out what am I actually trying to achieve with the AI, and then you break that down into what model am I going to choose, what provider do I need, how fast does this model have to be, and then once you have all these sets of questions, then you can approach it in a much more, I would say, tangible and efficient manner, and pick a right model, pick a right provider, and approach it in a more efficient way. So I think there's a huge challenge in actually teaching AI to all these different professionals across the industry. My focus, of course, obviously is mainly on the marketing side of things, but I guess across the board, getting to leverage and use these tools is actually quite challenging, because it seems very simple at first, but you can fall in a lot of like pitfalls, and so you have to find ways to avoid them. And so I think, for example, just relying too much on the basic core output that a model will give you can be a mistake. So you got to be able to kind of not only keep up to date with all the latest things that come out, but be able to challenge yourself and your own knowledge about AI. And so I think in that sense, educating professionals across the industry is really hard. A lot of people have also built processes over years and years and habits of using different tools. And now they're questioning them and figuring out how can I actually use AI to replace and actually change my way of approaching my day-to-day work. And I think for that, there's a huge challenge of teaching and educating people on what models they should use, what process they could use, how, for example, using agents work on a day-to-day basis. And so it's really, I think it's a threefold problem. It's how do we get over the hype, how do we educate ourselves, and how do we stay up to date with all the things that come out given the pace of the industry. I think AI education platforms play a huge role in this. As I said before, there's a huge challenge to kind of teach and educate people across the board, across the whole industry. And so in that sense, I think it's really important for companies and projects that want to help people level up in the AI, dive into very specific vertical and use cases. So whatever your industry is, whatever your role is, where you're doing HR, you're doing marketing, you're doing finance, there's a whole different approach for all of these different industries. And in that sense, AI education and AI-powered platforms that will help you level up are extremely important because they do the work, the heavy lifting of breaking down all these complex subtasks and figuring out what the appropriate use of AI could be for each of these. And so in that sense, I think they have a huge challenge and a huge role to play in this new industry. So I guess figuring out how to tailor an approach that speaks to both business and decision makers and actually the technical audience is quite challenging. I think it's hard to actually do both in one main communication. You have to find different channels and different avenues and different pieces of content to repurpose to these different audiences. So in my current job at Nebius Token Factory, for example, I'm actually doing exactly that. I'm selling to machine learning engineers, but I'm also selling to decision makers that will make the final decision on which provider, which model to use. And so for each of these, we have very different types of content and different types of streams and channel we will use for them. So for the technical audience, we will be doing much more deeper dives on the actual technical implementation of AI, what it brings them. And on the executive and business side, it's more about figuring out what the ROI can be, what the outcomes we can bring. And so it's about, on the business side, it's really more about like the money you save, the efficiency you can get, the way you can reinvent your processes. And on the more technical side, it's about really convincing them that you're the right solution for each of these technical bottlenecks that can be experiencing using AI. And so I think it's about really tailoring your messaging to each of these different audiences across different channels. And then at the end, bringing it all together into one main core messaging that kind of covers the whole spectrum. So it's interesting because like there's obviously a huge challenge of AI as an infrastructure, but I guess this is kind of the core base level that a lot of people tend to not see. That's quite an abstraction on the actual infrastructure level. A lot of people don't really care about the data centers or the chips or what's powering the AI. A lot of people are interested in what's the actual AI as a service software layer on top of it. And so I think there's an interesting challenge also on this specific problematic to kind of help people understand that under each AI model that's going, there's a actual existing data center, there's a chip, there's a server, there's people working on that hardware side of things. And I think it's interesting to figure out how that's also important for the people actually just using AI on a software level. That underlying all this, there's actually a very important infrastructure and hardware level of things. And so, for example, if you're talking about Europe on the sovereignty aspect, people tend to pay more and more attention about where the data is located, where the data centers, where the data is being processed. And I think that's also an interesting thing you have to include. Even if you're doing the software layer on top of things, you have to include in your messaging to help people understand my data stays in Europe, it's a sovereign, it's being treated in these data centers that have these like sustainable initiatives, etc. And so I think that's where the challenge lays, is speaking the hardware language to people that do not care and speak software language, and figuring out how you kind of find a middle ground between both. So my advice to companies like Camster that are trying to kind of build this AI ecosystem would be to really figure out the most efficient ways to stay relevant. So as I said, this industry is super fast paced, and so things keep moving forward all the time. And so you can really, especially if you're building curriculums and you're building training and you're trying to figure out how people can level up, you have to build something that's solid and grounded, but you also have to build something that stays relevant in 6 months to a year. And so in that sense, it's quite challenging to build a solid class that keeps also evolving dynamically. And so I think that's quite a challenge for you guys, is how do I teach people to use AI today? But how do I make sure that the ones that will be learning in 6 months, or the thing that they're learning today, don't go out of date in 6 months? And so I think that's quite a challenge for you guys. And so that's why it's really important to really stay up to date and build these classes in a more dynamic way, not as a basic fact, like something that keeps evolving with time and with the pace of the industry.